research department of the organisation. And I just want to take you through today using some work that we've done over the last few years, looking at examination questions and question papers from the past, looking from the present back towards the past. So what I'm going to do, the first 15 minutes or so, I'll take you through some examples from examination papers. I can only touch very briefly on some of the things we've found, but we have got research papers published which are listed in the back of your handouts, and I shall pass out some handouts for you. We'll talk through some of the things we can validly take from examination questions from the past. I then want to dip into a very brief discussion of semantics, talk a little bit about comparability, because my job title is comparability. Talk about pop comparability and what it means and whether it's a good thing, and then talk briefly about comparisons which can mislead. If you're interested in the content of my material, then if you look on our website, you can find the research section. This is the group archive section, which Gill talked about in my last talk. There's our journal research matters, where you find many of the articles. Just before I move on to the first slide from the past papers, just a little bit about what we did. In 2008, as part of the Cambridge Assessment 150th anniversary celebrations, we started looking back at examination questions from the past. We went from 2007 back every decade to sample what the question papers looked like and what exemplar examination questions looked like. And we wrote that up, and it proved to be very, very interesting. And we've done that at what we call the 16+ age range. So starting with GCSEs, going back through the O-level, and back to the junior school certificates before that. For the last year or so, we've been doing a similar paper looking at the 18+ examinations, so A-level and backwards through those. That's not yet available on our website, but it should be by about Christmas time. So, what can we look at validly from the past? I mean, they're a fascinating resource, past examination questions. We can look at the evolution of subject content. We can look at the way in which styles of question change. We can look at the direction of educational expectations over time. So, you know, the rubric, the structure of the examination, the testing approach. We can see so many different things. I can only look at a very small number of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Shakespeare, it being an anniversary year for Shakespeare. And you'll find in your handout the entirety of this paper. This is just one route through it, so candidates have to answer one question from every section. So I've taken question 1 from section 1, question 2 from section 2, and so on. Note the Gothic text, which I reproduced here. That's certainly changed. And also the fact that the examination took place on a Saturday. That's also something we don't see nowadays. Now, in 1858, Shakespeare wasn't a compulsory part of the examination, but it was the only paper which constituted English literature. So, de facto, in 1858, English literature was Shakespeare. It was part of a wider group examination, so candidates took a number of different subjects, which together made the examination up. What I'd like you to note on this one is the first two questions, and consider whether these days we would consider these part of English literature. State what you know of the personal history of Shakespeare, so the biographical detail of the author. And section 2, question 2, mention some of the causes which led to the subjection of the Roman Republic to one man. So that might, these days, be considered more to be Roman history and in a history paper. You'd certainly be very, very unlikely to encounter those sort of questions currently. If you continue through your handout, you'll find some Shakespeare questions from the A-level in 1987. This too was a compulsory paper. What's different about this is that in this we see much more analysis and analytical thinking required from the candidate. So even when the questions go beyond the play itself, so for example, section B, question 5A, it's asking about presentation of political issues, but in the context of the play. The candidate is drawn back to the play to frame their answer. So there's a lot more about characterisation, and there's a lot more about the relationship of the audience or the reader with the material. The other thing to note in this example is that the candidate gets some indication of the number of marks that are awarded to each part of the question. So a little bit more about expectations for the candidate. Coming right up to date, this is the A-level A2 unit from 2015, taken from our website. The question here, again, compulsory Shakespeare unit. The question here is slightly more straightforward. It's shorter. It's not broken down into multiple parts like we saw in 1987. But it is supported by this statement, which was the same for each of these Shakespeare questions, where the candidates are told that they're required to present a sustained literary judgment, demonstrate critical understanding, analyse ways in which the play's structure, form and language shape meaning and effects. So again, we have a change in what we're expecting from candidates. Those were just some examples from English literature to kick us off. I'm going to move on. I'm going to pick from a variety of different subjects, because I'm sure people have different interests. So French, this is back to 16 plus level. You've got this in your handout in full. It's on page 4. There's a lot of translation. Translate from English to French, insert correct translation of words, translate various passages. There is a composition or a continuation to a story, but by today's expectations of candidates, it's fairly dry and focused very much on the kind of technical side of language. I was amused to discover that the spoken French passage in 1917 is a dictation passage, so the candidate is listening and writing, but are not speaking. Contrast that in your handout now from pages, I think it's pages 5 to 11, you have an example of a 1987 French paper. Very obvious observation. It runs from pages 5 to 11 in your handout. So much more material because of the way in which the question paper has been written. So lots and lots of supporting material, diagrams, maps, pictures, very, very much a feature of the development of examination papers over time. At both 16 plus and 18 plus is the inclusion of more supporting material, more breakdown of questions into smaller parts. And just for your amusement than anything else, but occasionally when you're working through the archive materials, you come across an unexpected gem. And on page 12 of your handouts, you have a cartoon question. This was an illustration from French. And along with it, you've got the question, you've got the cartoon illustration, and you've got an extract from the examiner's report, written after the exam when the answers have been seen. And we can see that in these early days of using more illustrative material in exams, judging by the examiner's comments, they might have presented candidates with some unexpected hazards. The drawings of the famous landmarks of Paris weren't very forgiving to students who wanted to reference them but didn't know how to spell their names. Most of the candidates felt it was necessary to include the name of the artist who painted the Mona Lisa in their answer, and sadly they didn't always know who it was. And to quote the examiner, most candidates found it difficult to give expression to the final embrace, which also appears to have caused much amusement. So I'm not quite sure what the candidates wrote. Sadly, we don't have the candidate scripts, but whatever they wrote, it illustrated how they found it. Moving on to physics, still at 16 plus. Again, on the next page of your handout, page 12, you have a selection of questions from various years. You'll see in that the contrast between the more recent and the older examinations tended to be in the context of the questions. In the more recent examinations, the questions tended to be given a relevant, real-world context. In the older examinations, the main context seemed to be the school laboratory. Again, we recognised when we did the work on physics that more structure is given to the candidate in modern examinations. Physics is an example of one of the earlier points at which short structured questions appeared, as early as 1957. Mark allocation appeared from 1977 onwards. Looking at the direction of educational expectations over time, we can pull out from exam questions and exam papers interesting information to inform us. So, for example, we expect different groups of students from different points in time to have different experiences of life. So in English literature, we found the question, discuss somewhat of the ways in which modern drama seems to you to have been affected by other mass media and communication. And our initial impression was this can only be a fairly recent demand on students asking about mass media. In fact, it was 1967, so perhaps a bit less recent than you think. And that brings me, to another point, which is that you can't always rely on your expectations on this. You do have to be fairly systematic when you look at the questions. Continuing on education experiences over time, skills come and go within our educational culture. So, for example, we see in several different subjects in the very much older papers, we see memorisation. Examples are most obvious from English literature, where candidates will be given the first 2 lines of a poem or a part of a play and asked to provide the next 8. And so all that's really being tested then was the candidate's memory. Calculators in maths exams and physics exams. We did try once to find out how many times calculators had come in and gone back out again, and actually it proved a really difficult task because there's a number of different syllabuses in the subject at any given time. It was quite hard to come when calculators were considered really important, when they weren't. And my particular interest is the development of food technology over time, and particularly the cookery side of that. On page 14 of your handout, you have a number of different questions taken from the examinations I've got listed here. So we have housecraft in the 1930s and 40s, of which cookery was a part. And then cookery itself became a subject at O-level in its own right from the 50s to the 70s. From the 1980s onwards, it was incorporated into the design and technology suite. And there's a story behind that. It would have actually probably been lost from school curriculums if it hadn't have been. And now it's moved into food preparation and nutrition. But if you look at the questions in your handout and the examples, you'll see that the content of the questions reflected how the subject was being regarded at the time. So particularly the food technology era, candidates would be asked, for example, to show how computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture could be used to design cake icing. A practical task might be for them to draw a product box and include all the relevant labelling. So it had gone beyond just preparing food into many of the associated technologies around it. Finally, whilst I'm looking at these, sometimes the conduct of the examination changes. So this is going back to physics at 16 plus from 1957. When candidates took a physics practical test, they were allowed to ask for help during the course of the examination. So I'll just read out this bottom bit. It's suggested that the following announcement be made to candidates. The examiners do not want you to waste your time through inability to proceed with the experiment. Any candidate, therefore, who is unable to get on with his experiment after he's spent 15 minutes at it may come to me and ask for help. I shall report to the examiners any help given in this way, and some marks may be lost for the help given. That's an interesting reflection on practical tests at that time. I'm not convinced that would work these days. I think there would be a lot more legislation around how you would deal with the marks that might be lost and how much help one might give, but it's lovely to see an example like this from then. So in the examples we've looked at so far, I've touched on the various observations that can be validly made when we look back through examination questions. The content material, the style of the questions, the requirements from the candidate, as in this physics thing, the structure of the examination as a whole and the components from which it's made up, the contextualisation of the questions. But we do have to be careful, because once you start looking back at examples from the past, you start making comparisons, either with the present or with another period of the past. And that's where I'm going to slightly change what I'm talking about in the second half of my talk, which is about comparisons and the assumptions we make when we carry them out. And I'm going to start with a dip into semantics. Comparability. Things are comparable or not comparable. There's two meanings to comparable. You can say things are comparable and mean they may be compared. Or you can say things have been compared and have been similar. There's a number of different contexts for comparability. Education is a prime one. There's a lot of comparisons in education. There's comparisons between exam questions over time, like we're discussing today, between exam questions from different countries, between exam systems, again, often between different countries, between curricular content and syllabus content for two exams, say, from the same subject. If you've encountered the PISA or the TIMS studies, you've engaged with comparability. And there's a lot of us in the business trying to make sense of it. It exists in other contexts as well. Comparative genetics, if you watched the Horizon programme last week about modern humans and Neanderthal man, they were using comparative genetics to arrive at their conclusions. It's in manufacturing, it's in bioscience, it's in everyday energy tariffs, and it's in mathematics, but that's a very slightly different definition. And this is a slide that I borrowed from a colleague, Tom Bramley. And we're back to comparisons. What are we doing when we make comparisons? Now, hopefully when I hit this button, it won't go black again. So this is sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And we've got a judge, William Shakespeare. He's comparing two objects. Object one is thee. Object two is a summer's day. And he's comparing them on, let's just deal with one attribute at a time, the attribute of loveliness. And the result is that thee beats loveliness. And we do this every day, all of us. And we quite often put it onto a spectrum. So we're not saying exactly how much thee has beaten loveliness by, just that thee beats loveliness. Now that's okay for Shakespeare, even though he's got loveliness and temperateness, because they both fall out the same way. Thee beats everything. What happens if it was the case that thee beat the summer's day, but actually was less temperate? That's a problem, and we can illustrate this with fruit. Now, comparabilists are famous for their fruit analogies. How often have you heard somebody say it's like comparing apples with pears? So I'm going to live up to expectations and do that. I've got a comparison here that tells me that 9 strawberries equals a banana, a few bits of watermelon and 2/3 of an apple. I've got another comparison that tells me that an awful lot of strawberries equal a banana and a half a watermelon and a whole apple. And then I've got a comparison that tells me that 6 apples equals 9 strawberries, 6 bananas and half a watermelon. That seems a little bit illogical until you consider that each time I've used a different attribute to compare them on. So I've got equal weight, equal sugar content, and equal vitamin C content. We've also got an issue with standards, because standards is a word that carries so much baggage. What do we mean by it? Standards of what? You have to have a standard of something. The example I tend to use is he would have been a policeman but didn't meet the standard. It has a very different social implication, so he would have been a policeman but he wasn't tall enough, but in fact the latter is just the same. I have a colleague who judges meetings and events by his standard. How would he judge today's meeting? Actually, he'd have given it a 0, because his standard is all about the quality of the biscuits. I haven't got any. We tend, when we make comparisons, and particularly when we start making comparisons between exams from the past and exams from the present, we start bringing in standards. So how is all this relevant to what I was talking about before? Well, standards in assessment are made up from many, many sources. And when we're comparing backwards over time with exam questions from other eras, we have to consider the nature of the targeted cohort, which has probably changed in ways we can't imagine, as well as in ways that we can imagine. The educational expectations of the time. The applied marking criteria. Now, those of you who are in Gillian's talk would have heard the question about marking criteria. Up until about 20 years ago, there weren't marking criteria. Yet when we look at the 2015 paper, the English literature paper we looked at, candidates can look up the marking criteria from previous years, compare them to the questions that were being asked and know where they were going with that. And of course the entire qualification. We're very often looking at individual questions, particularly if you buy one of those books of past exam questions that are available for sort of quiz nights and so on. They've been completely taken out of the context of the qualification. Now, pop comparability. Pop comparability, which is our term, I hasten to add, it's a broad base of material similar to pop music or pop culture, which is in the media what happens when people make comparisons using exam questions from the past. So there's quite a lot of examples of these. There's journalists sitting current versions of their A-levels that they took 30 years ago and reporting on their experiences, journalists recruiting members of the public to do the same, TV programmes where students are immersed in the culture and the teaching of an era before sitting the exams. I don't know if anybody here remembers the That'll Teach 'em series of programmes in the late 90s. They're all retrospectives, making the same sort of comparisons that we've been looking at today, but making them judgmentally. There's the recent TV programme, Chinese School, Are Our Kids Tough Enough? There's an example of the same genre, but in that case the comparison is being made between different educational systems. Studies which carry out this sort of work, I mean, the advantage they have is very often budget and certainly reach. This is a page from the Radio Times from 2013, read by hundreds of thousands of people from many different walks of life, whereas academic papers tend to be read by the hundreds if we're lucky, and also by people who have an existing interest rather than reaching out to those who don't. Many of the pop comparability studies are very, very interesting, and they come really close as anybody can do to making an informed comparison across decades. And if you are interested, we do have a research paper which is referenced at the end. Others are a bit less robust, so let's go back to DARA. The title of the piece is What Happened When DARA Sat GCSE Maths. What did happen when DARA sat GCSE Maths? This was an article written, I think it's been jointly authored by John Norton, who is a journalist on the Radio Times and DARA Brain. It was an advert for a new TV programme in 2012. Dara Brain sat he sat one of the 3 exams that make up a GCSE. He used his experience of doing that to contrast with his memory of sitting similar exams at age 16. He declared, and in fact you can, I think you can see it on the top there, he declared it was too easy, it was understimulating. He got an A star, he did that in 10 minutes, the paper set time was an hour. And he thought it might be better if it contained some unexpected or unusual material. Now, I'm not knocking this study absolutely. The write-up contains some really interesting thoughts about comparisons and about exams. But what has he overlooked? He's overlooked the fact that he is not the target cohort for this exam. He's massively overqualified in the first place. He's got a degree in theoretical physics. And you can't regenerate a 16-year-old from a 41-year-old and disregard their ongoing experiences. I'm sure some of you in the room may know more than I do about the effects of memory distortion as well, which possibly came into it. He also didn't realise there were 2 further papers. He knew there was 1 further paper, but he didn't realise there were 2 further papers in the whole assessment. He's very, very able mathematician, and he was evidently a very able mathematician at age 16. But the cohort that the exam he took was designed to be for is the entirety of the GCSE cohort in 2015, so it has to be accessible at all levels. At the root of the article, he was championing the needs of the very, very able mathematics students, which is something that none of us at Cambridge Assessment would disagree with. But his method in terms of using this as a valid way of coming to a conclusion about a comparison using exam questions can be very highly criticised, and it's a beautiful example of the pitfalls we can fall into when we do this. So, in summary, you can make all sorts of really interesting observations about the development of subjects and about the development of examinations, but you can't validly say that then or now was easier or harder. There's just too much missing information. In fact, Dara O'Brien and James Norton might have made a more informed comparison if they'd looked at the 1988 papers as well, because those would have been the ones that Dara O'Brien would have taken at age 16. But for my purposes today, they provided me with an excellent example. And out of interest, the That Will Teach 'Em series, TV series, probably came as close as anybody will ever do to an effective comparison. They took some students who'd just finished their GCSEs, and they took them into a boarding school which wasn't being used for the summer holidays. They gave them 6 weeks worth of lessons being taught in the styles of the era. I think there were 4 series, each depicting a different era. So, for example, the 1950s. They fed them the food they would have eaten. They took away their mobile phones. But even then, I could vividly remember an extract where one of the students looked at the maths questions he was being asked to do and said, "But why would I bother? Because these days I'd use a calculator." And you thought, yes, you can take the child out of the then 20th century, but you can't take the 20th century out of the child, and therefore that would have had an effect on that child's motivation. Carrie's telling me I need to finish. I just want to show you a couple of things. I'm just going to finish off very quickly, Carrie. Going back to the things we can do, just to bring us full circle. This is just an example of a subject that doesn't exist in the form we see it today. It's called Trench on the Study of Words. First question is, what is meant by a word? What is the meaning of a word? I encountered it unexpectedly. Another interesting thing is that the exam time is from the 1858 collection of papers. It's given us 3 3/4 to 4 3/4 rather than 3:45. I had to look up trench to discover what the actual title meant, and according to the OED, it's an archival use, and it basically means to think about. But it said it in the OED. It said it was it's always been a vague usage, and that made me think. Well, today, with the regulator and so forth, the context we work in, we wouldn't get away with using a vague usage of a terminology in what is evidently an English exam. And then, this picture is of the craft hall in this building. You may have walked through it without knowing. It's now a cafe. What's really interesting is the complications of the rubric for the art exams, which were in place to ensure that this room didn't get overcrowded. So it stated, the 1977 specifications stated, pieces of pottery must not exceed 12 inches in any dimension, nor 7 pounds in weight. Pieces of sculptural carving must not exceed 3 feet in any dimension, nor 20 pounds in weight. And the last thing you've got in your handout to enjoy at home is just an exam question which is set in the context of wartime England, which Gillian alluded to. But again, it's a lovely example of just where we can pick out some social history from the exam. For me, it's an absolute privilege to be able to access materials like this from the Cambridge Assessment Group archive, and it's been a pleasure to share some of them with you today. I believe I don't.
Two very quick questions.
Any very quick questions?
Over the last 50 years, we understand dyslexia much more. Have you done Cambridge Assessment, done any assessment over the years on dyslexia and exams? I did read some research that you did some years ago, which failed to find if it was fair because of the nature of how dyslexia is or is not being diagnosed. I just wondered if you've done any more to look at whether it's fair.
I'm not 100% sure. I would say I'm not aware of any, but then I'm not necessarily aware of what's going on in the whole group. I can probably find out for you and find out if there's anything more recent.
But do you see, on the research that you've just shown us, do you see a difference in terms for the dyslexic person?
I think there's been a difference for all candidates because the art and the science of writing questions, examination questions, has changed over the years. There's a lot more now known. As you say, there's been a lot of research from ourselves and from other people about how candidates react to questions, and that has fed back into the question writing process continuously. So yes, I think all candidates' experience has changed dramatically, and that includes candidates with dyslexia.
This is still not fair.
Yeah. So there's one more quick question. I've got time
It's
to
a rather boring one, unless someone has an interesting one. The gentleman asked about the physics exam 1957, was it? It made me wonder whether you detected any pattern in terms of the length of exams, time allocated, whether by subject or over time, or
Yes,
whether there wasn't any pattern at all.
There's patterns in different subjects. If you look at our full report, it goes into enormous detail. But you can also, again, it goes back to our fruit slide and counting different things. So you can count the number of pages, and that won't necessarily give you an indication of the total, say, number of words, or you can count the number of words, or you can count the mark allocation, or you can count the weighting. Once you go back before about 1970, you're a little bit more limited because you don't have so much, you don't have mark indications, you certainly don't have the peripheral materials which give you things like weighting. You know, as Gillian said at the end of her previous talk, it was all in the examiner's head, you know, that the sort of record keeping that is now carried out just didn't exist back then.
Thank you, Jill. If anybody's interested to know any more about the work of our research division and of our archives, I invite you to go to our website at cambridgeassessment.org.uk. There's a wealth of information there.